The 23rd floor conference room smelled of expensive leather and bitter coffee, the kind of institutional precision that transforms human devastation into billable hours. I sat across from Dylan Rhodes, my soon-to-be ex-husband, watching him sign documents with the same casual confidence he had once reserved for merger agreements. His Mont Blanc pen moved across pages with practiced efficiency, each signature another severing of the life we had built together over 8 years. Ellie Navarro sat beside me, her dark eyes scanning every clause with the intensity of a hawk circling prey. Her burgundy blazer was impeccable, as always, but I caught the slight tightness around her mouth that meant she was calculating outcomes 3 moves ahead. Dylan's attorney, a silver-haired man whose hourly rate could fund a small nonprofit, shuffled papers with ceremonial gravity, as if we were signing a peace treaty rather than documenting the systematic dismantling of a marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Manhattan apartment goes to Miss Morgan along with her personal effects and professional materials, the mediator announced in the monotone voice that had narrated the past 3 hours. Mr. Rhodes retains the vacation property in Kennebunkport, Maine, and the yacht Morning Glory, both properties being solely titled under Rhodes Holdings LLC. I nodded without expression, though something cold settled in my chest. Those properties weren't just Dylan's acquisitions, they were blueprints I had drafted, designs. I had poured my architectural training into creating spaces that married Dylan's vision of success with my understanding of how light and space could transform daily existence. The vacation home's curved glass walls that captured sunrise over the Atlantic, the yacht's interior layout that maximized both elegance and functionality. Dylan had filed those properties under his corporate umbrella years ago when I was still naive enough to believe that what was his was ours. Regarding the business assets, the mediator continued, Mr. Rhodes retains full control of Rhodes Holdings LLC and its subsidiary companies. Miss Morgan receives no equity stake as per the prenuptial agreement signed in 2016. Ellie's pen paused mid-note. I caught her eye briefly, knowing she was thinking what I was thinking. The prenuptial agreement we had both signed without Dylan present, the one where I had insisted on certain clauses that seemed irrelevant at the time: intellectual property protections, design attribution rights, obscure legal language that Dylan's attorney had dismissed as harmless architectural paranoia. But Ellie and I had been Harvard Law Review together, and we both understood that seemingly harmless clauses could become nuclear weapons under the right circumstances. The final matter concerns the custody arrangement for Leo, the mediator said, consulting his notes. My spine straightened involuntarily. Leo, our 4-year-old golden retriever mix, was lying at home in his favorite spot beside the kitchen island, probably wondering why I had been gone so long. Leo, who had been my constant companion through Dylan's 18-hour workdays and endless business trips. Leo, who had slept beside my hospital bed after the miscarriage when Dylan was in Singapore closing a deal. Leo, who represented the only uncomplicated love that had survived the wreckage of our marriage. Mr. Rhodes has requested full custody of the animal, Dylan's attorney announced, citing his ability to provide appropriate care at his primary residence. The words hit me like ice water. Dylan, who had initially resented Leo's presence in our apartment. Dylan, who had complained about dog hair on his Italian suits. Dylan, who had only warmed to Leo when he realized that having a photogenic rescue dog enhanced his public image as a thoughtful, successful entrepreneur, now wanted to take the one constant source of joy in my increasingly uncertain future. Miss Morgan contests this arrangement, Ellie said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Leo was adopted solely by Miss Morgan prior to the marriage. Mr. Rhodes has no legal claim, however. Dylan's attorney smiled, the kind of predatory expression that cost $1,000 an hour. Mr. Rhodes has been the dog's primary caretaker for the past 18 months, as evidenced by veterinary records, grooming appointments, and registration updates, all of which list Mr. Rhodes as the primary contact. I stared at Dylan across the polished table, trying to decode the calculation behind his amber eyes. This wasn't about Leo. This was about control, about ensuring that I walked away with as little as possible, about demonstrating that even in defeat, he could still dictate terms. The man I had once believed I loved was systematically erasing me from my own life. The court recognizes Mr. Rhodes' claim, the mediator announced after a brief consultation. Custody of Leo is awarded to Mr. Rhodes effective immediately. The conference room fell silent except for the distant hum of Manhattan traffic 23 floors below. I felt something crack inside my chest, not the dramatic shattering of heartbreak, but the precise fracture of a load-bearing wall. The moment when structural integrity becomes impossible to maintain. I looked at Dylan, who was sliding his pen into his jacket pocket, with satisfaction, and realized that this wasn't the ending of our story. It was the moment I stopped playing defense. Is there anything else, miss? Morgan, the mediator, asked with the kind of manufactured sympathy that comes standard with divorce proceedings. C stood smoothly, gathering my purse and the folder Ellie had prepared, feeling Dylan's eyes tracking my movement. He expected tears or rage or some display of the emotional volatility he had accused me of during our marriage, but I had learned something valuable during 3 hours of watching him systematically dismantle our shared life. I had been thinking too small, actually. Yes, I said, my voice steady and clear. I'd like to review the original prenuptial agreement, the unredacted version with all intellectual property clauses intact. Dylan's expression shifted slightly, a microscopic crack in his composure that told me he didn't remember every detail of what he had signed 8 years ago when he was more focused on protecting his startup capital than reading legal fine print. I'll have my office send over the complete file, his attorney said, though I caught him glancing at Dylan with something that might have been concern. Thank you, I said, extending my hand to Dylan with professional courtesy. I hope you and Leo are very happy together. Dylan shook my hand, his grip firm and confident, his smile that practiced blend of charm and dismissal that had once made me feel special and now made me feel invisible. Take care of yourself, Cass, he said, using the nickname that had once felt intimate and now sounded like a pat on the head. I know this is hard, but you'll land on your feet. You always do. I smiled back at him, the kind of expression that could mean anything, and walked toward the elevator with Ellie beside me, her heels clicking against marble with military precision. We didn't speak until the elevator doors closed and we began our descent toward street level. Cass, Ellie said, her voice careful and professional, I know you're processing a lot right now, but I need you to know that the intellectual property clauses in your prenup are more comprehensive than most people realize. If Dylan has been using your architectural designs for commercial purposes without attribution or compensation, we might have grounds for a significant claim. I watched the floor numbers descending. 20, 19, 18. Each number marking our return to the real world, where I would have to figure out how to rebuild a life that Dylan had just systematically dismantled. How significant? I asked. Potentially very significant, Ellie said. Especially if he's filed patents or trademarks based on your work. The vacation home alone, if you can prove you designed the key architectural elements, could be worth $3.7 million in today's market. The yacht, if your interior layout designs are documented, could be another $2.2 million. The elevator reached the ground floor and we stepped into the gleaming lobby where security guards in expensive suits maintained the illusion that wealth could purchase safety. I followed Ellie toward the street, thinking about blueprints and contracts and the difference between what people remember and what they actually signed. There's something else, Ellie said as we reached the sidewalk. Something I've been meaning to tell you for the past 3 years. I stopped walking, the afternoon sunlight reflecting off glass towers, creating patterns of light and shadow across the concrete. When you asked me to review your prenup before you signed it, Ellie continued, I took the liberty of adding a few additional clauses, protective measures that seemed prudent at the time but that I never mentioned because I didn't want to undermine your faith in the marriage. What kind of protective measures? The kind that might allow you to reclaim assets that were developed using your intellectual property, Ellie said, even if those assets are currently titled under Dylan's corporate entities. I studied my best friend's face, seeing the lawyer who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, the woman who had built a reputation for protecting high net worth women in complex divorces, the strategist who had apparently been planning for this possibility longer than I had realized. You've been playing a longer game than I knew, I said. I've been protecting you the only way I knew how, Ellie replied, by making sure that if Dylan ever tried to write you out of your own story, you would have the legal tools to write yourself back in. We stood on the sidewalk while businesspeople in $1,000 suits hurried past us, carrying the weight of their own complicated lives. I thought about Leo, who would be confused and frightened when Dylan picked him up tonight. I thought about the vacation home where I had designed every window to capture specific moments of coastal light. I thought about the yacht where I had planned storage solutions and sight lines that would make entertaining feel effortless, but mostly I thought about the woman I had been 8 years ago, the recent graduate with a portfolio full of innovative designs and a head full of dreams, who had believed that love meant sacrifice, who had stepped back from her own career to support Dylan's ambitions, who had convinced herself that his success was their success and that building something together meant building something that would always be shared. That woman was gone. She had died slowly over 8 years of being professionally invisible, personally diminished, and emotionally managed. But the woman standing on the sidewalk in the October afternoon light had something that woman had never possessed. She had clarity. I want to see those prenup clauses, I told Ellie, all of them, and I want to talk to Thomas Baird, the forensic accountant, the one who audited Dylan's company 3 years ago and found those irregularities that Dylan claimed were clerical errors. Ellie smiled, and for the first time in months I saw real optimism in her expression. I'll call him tonight, she said, and Cass, for what it's worth, I think Dylan just made the biggest mistake of his life. I looked back at the gleaming tower where Dylan was probably celebrating his victory with his attorney, discussing how cleanly he had managed to minimize his losses, how effectively he had protected his assets from his emotional ex-wife. I think you're right, I said, but he won't realize it until it's too late. That evening I sat in my apartment, which felt enormous and empty without Leo's presence, without the sound of his tail thumping against furniture. When I came home from work, I opened my laptop and navigated to a folder I had created years ago when I was still naive enough to believe that documenting my contributions to Dylan's success was about sharing credit rather than protecting myself. The folder was labeled contingency, and it contained architectural drawings, blueprints, photographs, and design documents that chronicled my role in creating the properties Dylan had just claimed as exclusively his own. I had spent 8 years building Dylan's vision of success, providing the aesthetic framework that had elevated his tech entrepreneur brand from competent to compelling, and now I was going to use that documentation to take back everything that had always been mine. Opened the first file, a detailed blueprint of the Kennebunkport vacation home showing the structural modifications I had designed to maximize ocean views while maintaining the historical character of the 1890s cottage. The document was dated 2 years before Dylan's LLC had purchased the property, and it bore my architectural seal along with my signature. Second file contained interior design specifications for the yacht Morning Glory, including the custom storage solutions that had allowed Dylan to entertain investors in a space that felt more like a floating penthouse than a boat. The plans were annotated in my handwriting with notes about site lines, traffic flow, and the psychological impact of different lighting schemes. Worked through the folder, methodically cataloging 8 years of intellectual property that Dylan had incorporated into his business ventures without attribution or compensation. I found sketches I had forgotten about, design concepts that had been implemented without my knowledge, and a paper trail that told the story of how my architectural training had been quietly absorbed into Dylan's corporate identity. At midnight, I closed the laptop and walked to the window overlooking Central Park, where the darkness was punctuated by street lights and the distant glow of other people's lives. Leo would have followed me to the window, pressing his warm body against my legs in the unconscious comfort that dogs provide to humans who are planning complicated revenge. But I didn't need comfort anymore. I needed precision. Cafe on East 79th Street was the kind of place where privacy could be purchased with expensive coffee and corner tables that discouraged eavesdropping. I arrived first, as always, choosing a seat with sight lines to both entrances and spreading the contents of my contingency folder across the small table like architectural evidence of a crime that hadn't been prosecuted. Yetali entered exactly on time, her charcoal wool coat and leather briefcase announcing her presence as a serious woman conducting serious business. She ordered her usual double espresso and joined me at the table, scanning the documents I had arranged with the speed of someone trained to absorb complex information quickly. This is more comprehensive than I expected, she said, lifting a blueprint to examine the architectural seal in the corner. These aren't just ideas or concepts, these are detailed plans with your professional credentials attached, and most of them predate Dylan's property acquisitions by months or years. I watched her review the yacht specifications, noting how her expression shifted from professional interest to something resembling predatory satisfaction. The Morning Glory purchase was finalized in March 2019, I said, but I completed the interior design specifications in August 2018. Dylan told me he was considering a yacht investment and asked me to sketch some ideas for optimizing the space. I thought it was theoretical planning, but you signed and dated everything. Habit from architecture school. Every design gets documented and credited, even preliminary work. Ellie pulled out her phone and began photographing the blueprints with the methodical efficiency of someone building a legal case. The vacation home documentation is even more detailed. I continued. Dylan purchased the Kennebunkport property in 2020. But I designed the structural modifications in 2018, including the glass wall installation that became the signature feature of the house. He told me his real estate agent had found this cottage with potential and asked me to imagine how it could be transformed, and you provided detailed architectural plans complete with engineering specifications, material recommendations, and aesthetic guidelines. I said, I treated it like a professional consultation because Dylan said he wanted to understand the renovation costs before making an offer. Ellie set down her coffee cup with a sharp click that echoed my own growing satisfaction. Cass, these documents establish clear intellectual property ownership, she said. If Dylan implemented your designs without compensation or attribution, we have grounds for asset recovery that goes far beyond typical divorce settlement terms. I had spent the previous evening researching intellectual property law with the obsessive focus of someone who had discovered that her marriage wasn't the only thing that had been systematically exploited. I understood now that Dylan's business success wasn't just built on his tech entrepreneurship, it was built on my architectural expertise applied to creating the lifestyle brand that had attracted investors, clients, and media attention to his companies. There's something else, I said, opening my laptop to show Ellie a spreadsheet I had created. I tracked every property acquisition Dylan made during our marriage and cross-referenced them with my design work. The pattern is consistent. He would ask me to sketch ideas for theoretical projects, then implement those designs months later after purchasing properties through his LLCs. The spreadsheet revealed a timeline of systematic intellectual property theft disguised as casual conversation. 8 years of Dylan asking his wife for professional advice, then monetizing that advice without acknowledgement or compensation. The Manhattan office space that had become Rhodes Holdings headquarters incorporated my suggestions for an open plan layout that projected innovation and collaboration. The Hamptons rental property that Dylan used for client entertainment featured my recommendations for outdoor lighting that would extend usable space and evening hours. This isn't just about the vacation home and yacht, Ellie said, studying the spreadsheet. This is about a pattern of using your expertise to build his brand while keeping you professionally invisible. Exactly, I said, and now I want to become visible again. Ellie closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone who had just realized that her client possessed nuclear weapons. I'm going to call Thomas Baird, she said. If Dylan has been filing patents or trademarks based on your work, we need to know immediately. But first, I want to review the intellectual property clauses in your prenup to understand exactly what legal tools we have available. How long will that take for the prenup review? 2 days for Thomas to conduct a preliminary investigation, maybe a week. Ellie paused. Cass, I need you to understand that what we're discussing isn't just about recovering assets. This is about proving systematic fraud. If Dylan has been using your designs to generate revenue without compensation, we're talking about potential criminal liability, not just civil claims. I thought about Dylan's satisfied expression in the conference room yesterday, the casual way he had claimed Leo, as if taking my dog was just another business decision, the assumption that I would accept his terms because I had always accepted his terms. Good, I said. I want him to understand what systematic really means. After Ellie left, I remained at the cafe reviewing the contents of my contingency folder and thinking about the difference between preparation and paranoia. I had created this documentation not because I suspected Dylan of specific crimes, but because my architectural training had taught me that details matter, that assumptions become expensive mistakes, and that the only protection against future problems is thorough documentation of present circumstance. My phone buzzed with a text from Harper Lynn, my mentee at the architectural firm where I maintained a consulting relationship. Harper was 26, with the kind of ambitious energy I had once possessed. Before I learned that supporting someone else's dreams could cost you your own dreams. But Harper also had something I had lacked at her age. She had mentors who encouraged her to protect her work and claim credit for her innovation. Can you meet this afternoon? Harper's text read, I want to show you something interesting about that medical center project we discussed. He smiled, remembering our previous conversation about a luxury medical facility that was being marketed as an innovative approach to wellness architecture. Harper had been excited about the design philosophy until I explained that revolutionary architecture was often just good architecture that had been properly promoted. Sure, I replied. What did you find? You need to see this in person, Harper texted back. But I think someone is using design concepts we've Scene before I closed my laptop and gathered my materials, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that other people were also paying attention to details that seemed irrelevant until they became evident. Architectural firm occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, the kind of space that announced creative innovation while maintaining the professional infrastructure necessary to attract corporate clients. Harper met me in the lobby holding a glossy brochure and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something disturbing. I was researching the Meridian Medical Center project, she said as we rode the elevator to her floor, trying to understand why their wellness architecture looked so familiar. And I found this promotional material. She handed me the brochure, which featured stunning photographs of a facility that integrated natural materials with modern technology, creating spaces that felt more like luxury spas than clinical environments. The design philosophy emphasized the psychological impact of environmental factors on healing outcomes, and the architectural elements that could support both patient comfort and medical efficiency recognized the concepts immediately, because I had spent months developing them for a theoretical project that Dylan had described as market research for potential healthcare investments. The curved reception desk that created intimate conversation spaces while maintaining sight lines for security. The skylights positioned to provide natural light therapy during extended treatment sessions. The materials palette that balanced warmth with sterility. This is my work, I said, studying the photographs that showed my design concepts, implemented with precision and attention to detail that proved this wasn't coincidental inspiration. That's what I thought, Harper said, but look at the attribution. The brochure credited the design to Rhodes Architectural Consulting, a company I had never heard of, but that apparently specialized in innovative wellness environments. The principal architect was listed as Dylan Rhodes, with a biography that described his vision for integrating technology, entrepreneurship with environmental psychology. Felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest as I realized that Dylan hadn't just stolen my marriage and my dog, he had stolen my professional identity, creating a consulting company that monetized my expertise while erasing my existence from the architectural record. Harper, I said, I need you to help me research something, and I need you to understand that what we find might be complicated. What kind of complicated? I looked at the young woman who reminded me of myself at her age, eager to believe that talent and hard work would be sufficient to build a meaningful career, willing to trust that collaboration meant partnership rather than exploitation, the kind where someone's professional success is built on other people's uncredited work, I said, and where fixing the problem requires documenting the crime. Harper's expression shifted from curiosity to anger, the clean fury of someone who had worked too hard to accept that achievement could be stolen. What do you need me to do? I smiled, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering unexpected allies in a battle you had planned to fight alone. I need you to help me find every project that Rhodes Architectural Consulting has completed in the past 5 years, I said. And I need you to help me prove that none of those innovations belong to Dylan Rhodes. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing Harper's research and feeling the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Dylan hadn't just appropriated my designs for his personal properties. He had created an entire consulting business that monetized my architectural expertise while keeping me professionally invisible. Rhodes Architectural Consulting had completed projects worth over $12 million in revenue using design concepts that I had developed during our marriage. Business had been incorporated as a subsidiary of Rhodes Holdings LLC, which meant that Dylan had been building his architectural consulting empire using my work while claiming full credit and keeping all profits. The timing was particularly elegant, since he had established the company during the period when I was dealing with my miscarriage and subsequent depression, when I was too emotionally fractured to pay attention to his expanding business interests. He opened my laptop and began documenting the connection between my original designs and Dylan's commercial projects, creating a timeline that would demonstrate systematic intellectual property theft spanning multiple years and multiple projects. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also professionally devastating. Dylan had built his reputation as an innovative architect using my innovations, but as I worked through the documentation, I realized that Dylan had made a critical error in his systematic theft of my professional identity. He had been so focused on erasing my credit that he had forgotten to erase my legal rights, and according to the intellectual property clauses in our prenuptial agreement, clauses that Ellie had apparently strengthened without my knowledge. I retained ownership of any architectural work created during our marriage, regardless of how that work was subsequently monetized. Edie called Ellie and left a message that was probably longer than necessary but captured the essential facts. Dylan had created an architectural consulting business using my designs. Rhodes Architectural Consulting was generating significant revenue from projects that violated my intellectual property rights, and the prenuptial agreement that was supposed to protect Dylan's assets might actually provide me with the legal tools necessary to claim ownership of his most valuable business venture. Essie hung up the phone and looked around my empty apartment, thinking about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice was about restoring balance, ensuring that people received credit for their work and compensation for their contributions. Revenge was about causing pain in proportion to pain received. What I was planning was definitely justice, but I was beginning to think it might also be the most satisfying revenge I had ever imagined. Harper's office overlooked the East River through floor-to-ceiling windows that captured the changing light throughout the day, making it the kind of workspace that architectural students dreamed about and experienced professionals killed for. She had arranged our meeting for late afternoon when the autumn sun would create dramatic shadows across her drafting table, where she had spread copies of the Meridian Medical Center promotional materials alongside printouts of my original design concepts. I spent the weekend researching Rhodes Architectural Consulting, she said as I examined the side-by-side comparison of my sketches and the implemented project. The company has completed 7 major projects since 2019, all of them using design philosophies that appeared in your unpublished work from 2017 and 2018. I studied the evidence Harper had assembled, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that someone else shares your attention to detail and your intolerance for intellectual dishonesty. The similarities weren't coincidental or inspirational. They were systematic appropriation of my architectural concepts, implemented with the kind of precision that required access to my original specifications. The Wellness Center project is the most obvious example, Harper continued, but look at this corporate headquarters in Austin that Rhodes Architectural completed last year. She showed me photographs of an office building that featured my recommendations for biophilic design elements that would reduce employee stress while increasing productivity. The building incorporated living walls positioned to provide visual relief during long work sessions, natural material textures that would ground people who spent their days staring at computer screens, and lighting schemes that supported circadian rhythms for better mental health. I developed those concepts for a theoretical project that Dylan claimed his company was considering, I said. He told me he wanted to understand how environmental psychology could improve workplace efficiency, and I gave him a complete analysis of design strategies that would support employee well-being. And he implemented your analysis without attribution or compensation, apparently, I said, studying the Austin project documentation that credited Dylan Rhodes as the principal architect and innovative thinker behind the workplace wellness philosophy. Harper pulled up additional files on her laptop showing me project after project that incorporated my design innovations. Dylan had been systematically mining my expertise for years, building his architectural consulting business on the foundation of my unpublished work while keeping me financially and professionally invisible. There's something else, Harper said, something that might be even more significant than the individual projects. She opened a new folder containing what appeared to be patent applications and trademark registrations filed by Rhodes Holdings LLC. Over the past 3 years, Dylan has been filing intellectual property claims on design innovations that originated in your work, she said, including patents for specific architectural techniques and trademark protection for design methodologies that you developed years before he filed the applications. I felt something cold and precise settle in my chest as I realized that Dylan's theft of my work wasn't just about individual projects. It was about systematically claiming ownership of my intellectual contributions to the field of environmental architecture. He had been building his reputation as an innovator by stealing my innovations, then protecting those stolen innovations with patents and trademarks that would prevent me from using my own ideas. How many patents? I asked. 12 so far, Harper said, covering everything from therapeutic lighting design to stress reduction material selection, and all of them filed under Dylan's name as the primary inventor. I studied the patent applications, seeing my design concepts described in legal language that transformed my architectural theories into Dylan's protected intellectual property. The Applications were comprehensive and detailed, proving that Dylan hadn't just casually appropriated a few ideas, he had systematically documented my work, then claimed legal ownership of my professional innovations. Harper, this is more than intellectual property theft, I said. This is identity theft. Dylan has been erasing me from my own career. She nodded with the kind of righteous anger that comes from discovering systematic injustice disguised as business success. What are you going to do? I looked out at the East River, thinking about the difference between problems and opportunities. Dylan had created a paper trail that documented his systematic appropriation of my work, but he had also created evidence that could be used to prove his crimes. The patents and trademarks that were supposed to protect his stolen innovations would become the foundation for proving that those innovations belonged to me. I'm going to take back everything that was always mine, I said, starting with the architectural consulting business that Dylan built using my work. How I smiled thinking about the intellectual property clauses in my prenuptial agreement that Ellie had apparently crafted with precisely this scenario in mind. Very carefully and very thoroughly, I said, and with better legal representation than Dylan probably realizes he needs. That evening I met Ellie at her office, a sleek space in Midtown that announced her success at protecting high net worth women from the financial consequences of failed marriages. Her conference room overlooked the Hudson River and contained the kind of technology that allowed for secure conversations about matters that could destroy reputations and end careers. I've reviewed your prenuptial agreement, Ellie said, spreading the document across her conference table, and I need you to understand that the intellectual property clauses are more comprehensive than most people would consider necessary for a standard marriage contract. I studied the legal language that I had signed 8 years ago when I was more focused on wedding planning than asset protection, seeing clauses that address scenarios I hadn't imagined at the time. Patent applications filed by either party using work created during the marriage, trademark protection for business ventures that incorporated shared intellectual property and ownership rights for architectural designs regardless of how those designs were subsequently commercialized. These clauses were written by someone who understood that intellectual property theft could be disguised as collaboration, I said. They were written by someone who wanted to make sure that if your husband ever tried to steal credit for your work, you would have legal recourse, Ellie replied. I may have been slightly more paranoid than necessary when I drafted this agreement. I looked at my best friend and realized that she had been protecting me from possibilities I hadn't considered, threats I hadn't recognized, patterns of exploitation that her legal training had taught her to anticipate. How paranoid. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Paranoid enough that according to the terms you and Dylan both signed, you retain ownership rights to any architectural work created during your marriage, regardless of how that work is commercialized, and Dylan's patents and trademarks filed using your innovations can be challenged based on prior creation and documentation. Ellie opened her laptop and showed me a legal analysis she had prepared documenting the connection between my original designs and Dylan's subsequent patent applications. The analysis was thorough and damning, proving that Dylan had systematically violated the intellectual property protections in our prenuptial agreement. This isn't just about recovering assets anymore, she said. This is about proving that Dylan built his business empire through systematic fraud, and the legal penalties for intellectual property theft can include criminal charges, not just civil liability. I thought about the conference room where Dylan had confidently claimed Leo as his final victory, the casual way he had dismissed my contributions to his success, the assumption that I would accept his terms because I had always been too grateful for his attention to demand recognition for my work. I want to talk to Thomas Baird, I said, and I want him to start investigating Rhodes Holdings LLC immediately. Already scheduled, Ellie said. He's available tomorrow afternoon. And he's very interested in reviewing Dylan's financial records, especially the revenue generated by Rhodes Architectural Consulting. I smiled, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that preparation and patience can transform victimization into victory. There's one more thing, I said. I want to make sure that when we expose Dylan's fraud, we do it in a way that gives credit to every woman whose work has been stolen by men who thought intellectual property theft was just good business. Ellie's expression shifted to something that looked like pride mixed with anticipation. What did you have in mind? I want to make Dylan's downfall a case study in why stealing from women is the stupidest business strategy imaginable, I said, and I want To do it in a way that ensures no one ever makes the mistake of underestimating Cassandra Morgan again. The next morning, I woke up in my empty apartment and realized that for the first time in months, I was looking forward to the day ahead. Dylan had taken Leo, but he had also made the critical error of assuming that taking my dog meant taking my fight. The man who had systematically stolen my professional identity was about to discover that I had spent 8 years documenting every theft, and that I had legal representation who understood that the best revenge was perfect justice served with surgical precision. Made coffee in the kitchen where Leo used to wait for breakfast, thinking about the difference between losing and strategic retreat. Dylan thought he had won our divorce by claiming the assets that mattered to him, but he had actually given me the motivation necessary to reclaim the work that had always been mine, the patents that belonged to me, and the business empire that he had built using my innovation. CC opened my laptop and began reviewing the timeline Harper and I had created, documenting 8 years of systematic intellectual property theft disguised as marriage. The evidence was comprehensive, the legal foundation was solid, and the penalties for Dylan's crimes would be sufficient to ensure that he understood the true cost of underestimating the woman he had tried to erase. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas Baird confirming our afternoon meeting and noting that his preliminary research had already identified several financial irregularities in Rhodes Holdings LLC that warranted deeper investigation. He smiled and finished my coffee, thinking about Leo, who would be confused and frightened in Dylan's apartment, but who would eventually understand that sometimes the people who love you have to disappear temporarily in order to save you permanent. Life, where Dylan had started by taking my dog, was about to become the battle that would define both of our legacies, but only one of us understood that the battlefield had been prepared years in advance, and only one of us had been training for this fight since the day we signed our prenuptial agreement. The coastal Maine cafe where I met Nadine Sharp existed in the kind of timeless elegance that wealthy people used to discuss matters that required discretion. Weathered cedar shingles and whitewash trim creating the impression of casual sophistication, while the clientele conducted conversations that could reshape fortunes with handshake agreements. Nadine had chosen a corner table that provided privacy and ocean views, her silver hair pulled into a chignon that announced decades of experience managing situations that lesser people would consider impossible. Cassandra Morgan, she said, extending a hand with the kind of firm grip that suggested she had spent her career dealing with men who underestimated women. Ellie Navarro speaks very highly of your strategic thinking. I studied Nadine's face, noting the sharp intelligence behind designer glasses and the careful way she had arranged her materials, suggesting someone who understood that details mattered more than dramatics. Her reputation in Manhattan real estate circles was legendary. She specialized in asset management for ultra-high net worth divorces, where the difference between winning and losing could be measured in tens of millions of dollars. I understand you have an interest in property transfer strategies, Nadine continued, her voice carrying the kind of precision that made expensive hourly rates seem reasonably. Opened the folder containing my architectural documentation and selected the blueprints for the Kennebunkport vacation home. Spreading them across the table between our coffee cups. I designed this property, I said. Complete architectural specifications, structural modifications, and aesthetic guidelines. But the current owner believes he acquired it independently. Nadine examined the blueprints with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating real estate investments, her expression shifting from professional interest to something resembling predatory satisfaction as she recognized the quality and comprehensiveness of my documentation. These are detailed professional plans, she said, with your architectural seal and signature dated to years before the property purchase and according to the property records I reviewed before this meeting. The current owner, Dylan Rhodes, implemented your specifications with remarkable fidelity. Because they were my specifications, I said. He asked me to design the renovations as a theoretical exercise, then implemented my plans without attribution or compensation. Nadine smiled, the kind of expression that suggested she had encountered this particular form of intellectual property theft before, and had developed effective strategies for addressing it. The interesting aspect of this situation, she said, is that your architectural plans establish a legal claim to creative ownership of the property improvements, which under Maine property law could translate to financial ownership of the enhanced property value. I felt something sharp and satisfying settle in my chest as I realized that Nadine understood not just the legal implications of my documentation, but the strategic possibilities for leveraging that documentation into asset recovery. How would that Work property enhancement law recognizes that significant improvements to real estate can create ownership claims, especially when those improvements were designed by licensed professionals whose work was implemented without compensation. Nadine explained, if we can establish that your architectural innovations increase the property value by a substantial amount, we might be able to claim partial ownership based on your creative contributions. She pulled out her laptop and showed me a valuation analysis she had apparently prepared before our meeting. The Kennebunkport property had been purchased for $1.2 million in 2020, but recent comparable sales suggested a current market value of $3.7 million. The increase was primarily attributed to the architectural modifications that had transformed a charming but outdated cottage into a sophisticated oceanfront retreat. The appreciation is almost entirely due to the renovations that implemented your designs, Nadine said, which means your architectural work created approximately $2.5 million in added property value. I studied the valuation data, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that your professional expertise has been systematically undervalued by someone who profited from that undervaluation. What about the yacht? Nadine opened a second file containing documentation for the Morning Glory, a 65-foot luxury yacht that Dylan had purchased in 2019 for $1.8 million, but that currently carried a market value of $2.9 million. Yacht valuations are more complex, she said, but your interior design specifications appear to have transformed a standard luxury vessel into a floating entertainment space that commands premium charter rates. The custom modifications you designed have significantly enhanced both the yacht's functionality and its revenue potential. I looked at the photographs of the yacht's interior, recognizing my design concepts implemented with the kind of attention to detail that proved Dylan had been working from my specifications rather than developing his own innovations. The curved bar that maximized social interaction while maintaining sight lines to ocean views. The sleeping quarters that balanced privacy with spatial efficiency. The storage solutions that allowed for extended entertaining without feeling cramped. Both properties represent substantial assets that were enhanced using your professional expertise without compensation, Nadine said, and both properties are currently owned by LLCs that Dylan controls, which makes them vulnerable to legal challenges based on intellectual property claims. I thought about the conference room where Dylan had confidently claimed these properties as his exclusive assets. The casual way he had dismissed my contributions to his success, the assumption that I would accept his ownership of assets that incorporated my professional work. What would it take to challenge his ownership? Patience, precision, and excellent documentation, Nadine replied, which you appear to possess in abundance. The legal process would involve filing claims against the LLCs that own the properties, establishing your intellectual property rights through architectural documentation, and leveraging property enhancement law to claim financial ownership proportional to your creative contributions. She paused and leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone who had just outlined a complex but achievable strategy. The beautiful aspect of this approach, she continued, is that Dylan's attempts to protect his assets by placing them in corporate entities actually makes them more vulnerable to intellectual property challenges. Individual ownership would provide certain legal protections, but LLC ownership means the properties can be redistributed based on documented contributions to their value. I smiled, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that someone's attempt to outsmart you has actually provided you with additional weapons. How long would this process take if we move quickly and Dylan doesn't realize what's happening until it's too late? Approximately 6 to 8 weeks, Nadine said. The key is filing all claims simultaneously so he can't take protective measures once he understands the scope of the challenge. I thought about Leo, who was probably confused and unhappy in Dylan's apartment, wondering why his routine had been disrupted, wondering when I would come to take him home. I want to proceed, I said, but I want to make sure that when Dylan realizes what's happening, he understands that this isn't emotional revenge, this is professional justice. Nadine's smile shifted to something that looked like genuine admiration. Miss Morgan, I've been managing complex asset recovery for 23 years, and I can tell you that the most effective strategy is always the one that transforms personal grievance into professional accountability. Your ex-husband apparently thought he could steal your work and erase your contributions to his success. He's about to discover that intellectual property theft has consequences that extend far beyond divorce court. That afternoon, I drove to the Kennebunkport property using the key I had kept from our marriage. telling myself that I was conducting a final property inspection to document the current condition of my architectural work, but knowing that I was really saying goodbye to a space that had once represented everything. Dylan and I were building together. The house sat on 3 acres of oceanfront property, its glass walls capturing late afternoon light in the precise patterns I had calculated when I designed the window placement. The curved deck I had specified to follow the natural coastline created a seamless transition between interior and exterior space, while the material palette of weathered cedar and native stone grounded the modern elements in the historical context of coastal Maine. Walked through rooms that felt familiar and foreign, simultaneously recognizing my design concepts but seeing them implemented in a life that no longer included me. The master bedroom where Dylan and I had planned to spend peaceful weekends now contained evidence of his current relationship, expensive perfume on the nightstand, clothing in sizes I had never worn, photographs of Dylan with a woman who looked like a younger version of the wife he had just discarded. But the space itself remained true to my original vision, the skylights positioned to provide natural light therapy during long winter months, the built-in storage that maximized functionality without sacrificing aesthetic appeal, the sightlines that connected every room to ocean views, creating a sense of constant connection to the natural environment. He opened my laptop and began documenting the current condition of the property, photographing every detail that proved Dylan had implemented my specifications with precision and attention that demonstrated he had been working from my professional plans rather than developing his own ideas. The crown molding profiles matched my architectural drawings exactly. The custom millwork reflected my specifications for integrating modern convenience with historical character. The lighting fixtures were positioned according to my calculations for optimal task and ambient illumination. As I worked through the house, I realized that Dylan had actually improved upon some of my original concepts, adding refinements that enhanced the overall design without compromising my fundamental vision. The man who had stolen my work had at least been intelligent enough to implement it properly, creating a space that represented the best possible version of my architectural intentions. He finished documenting the interior and walked onto the deck overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, thinking about the difference between ownership and authorship. Dylan owned this property legally, but I had authored its transformation from charming cottage to sophisticated retreat. He possessed the deed, but I possessed the creative vision that had made the property valuable. My phone buzzed with a text from Ellie, asking for a status update on my meeting with Nadine. I replied that the asset recovery strategy was more promising than expected and that we should schedule a conference call with Thomas Baird to coordinate the financial investigation with the property claims. Another message appeared, this one from Harper, who had apparently continued researching Rhodes Architectural Consulting even after I had left her office. Found something interesting. She wrote, "Can you meet tomorrow morning?" She stood on the deck watching sunset create patterns of light and shadow across the ocean and thinking about the woman I had been when I designed this space, someone who believed that creating something beautiful with the person you loved was worth sacrificing credit for your contribution, someone who thought that shared success meant shared recognition, someone who had been naive enough to believe that love was sufficient protection against exploitation. That woman was gone, but her work remained, and tomorrow I would begin the process of reclaiming both the credit and the compensation that had always belonged to Harry. Locked the house and drove back toward Portland, thinking about the difference between theft and recovery. Dylan had stolen my work, but I was about to take back my legacy, and unlike his theft, my recovery would be entirely legal, entirely documented, and entirely devastating to the business empire he had built using my professional expertise. The evening sky was clear and cold, with early stars visible above the Atlantic Ocean by the time I reached my hotel. The kind of autumn night that made coastal Maine feel like the edge of the world. I ordered room service and spent the evening reviewing the asset recovery timeline Nadine had provided, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that patient planning and thorough documentation could transform victimization into victory. Dylan thought he had won our divorce by taking Leo and keeping the properties, but he had actually provided me with the motivation necessary to reclaim work that was always mine. Assets that incorporated my professional expertise and recognition that I should have demanded years. Agua fell asleep thinking about Leo, who would eventually understand that sometimes the people who love you have to disappear temporarily in order to save you permanently, and about Dylan, who was about to discover that stealing from an architect required more than charm and confidence. It required Understanding the structural integrity of what you were trying to take. Apathy Whitney Museum's contemporary architecture created dramatic shadows in the late afternoon light as I moved through the exhibition of emerging artists, thinking about the difference between innovation and appropriation, the kind of aesthetic questions that had once seemed theoretical but now felt personally urgent. I had arrived early for the gallery reception, partly because I wanted to support Harper's friend, whose installation was being featured, but mostly because I needed time to think through my conversation strategy for the evening. Dylan Rhodes appeared beside me as I studied a piece about reclaimed materials and forgotten histories. His presence, both expected and carefully orchestrated since Harper had mentioned that Dylan's younger brother would be attending the reception. Gavin looked older than his 30-for-years, stress lines around his eyes suggesting that managing Dylan's financial empire was taking its toll. Cassandra, he said with genuine warmth, I was hoping you'd be here. Harper mentioned you've been mentoring her and supporting emerging artists. I smiled, accepting his embrace and noting that he still used my full name, unlike Dylan, who had gradually shortened it to Cass, then to nothing at all. As our marriage deteriorated, Gavin had always treated me with the kind of respectful attention that suggested he understood I was more than just Dylan's decorative wife. I try to support work that deserves recognition, I said, choosing my words carefully, especially when artists are creating something genuinely innovative. We moved through the gallery together, discussing the exhibited pieces with the kind of sophisticated conversation that Manhattan art receptions required. I noticed that Gavin seemed more relaxed than usual, his typical nervous energy replaced by something that looked like resignation or perhaps relief. How are you handling the divorce proceedings? He asked as we paused in front of a sculpture about power dynamics and hidden structures. Better than expected, I replied. It's been educational, discovering how much I didn't know about Dylan's business arrangements. Gavin's expression shifted slightly, a microscopic crack in his composure that suggested my comment had landed closer to a nerve than intended. Dylan tends to compartmentalize his various ventures, he said. Even I don't always understand how all the pieces fit together. I studied his face, recognizing the careful way he had phrased his response as someone trying to maintain loyalty while acknowledging uncomfortable truths that must make financial management challenging. I said, especially when you're responsible for maintaining accurate records across multiple entities. Sometimes I feel like I'm tracking investments I never knew Dylan was making. Gavin admitted he's been expanding into new sectors without much consultation with the existing finance team. I felt something sharp and promising settle in my chest as I realized that Gavin was struggling with the same confusion about Dylan's business activities that had motivated my own investigation. New sectors like what? Architectural consulting, real estate development, intellectual property licensing, Gavin said, areas where Dylan suddenly claims expertise but where I can't always track the origin of his knowledge base. We paused near a wine station where other gallery visitors were conducting the kind of sophisticated small talk that disguised serious business negotiations. I accepted a glass of white wine and used the moment to consider how much information I could extract without revealing my own research. The architectural consulting seems particularly successful, I said. Rhodes Architectural has been generating impressive revenue from what I understand. Gavin nodded, but his expression suggested he was still processing something that didn't quite make sense to him. The projects are definitely profitable, he said, but Dylan's approach to business development in that sector has been unusually secretive. He handles most client communications personally, and he's been using offshore LLCs for contract management, which makes financial tracking more complicated. I sipped my wine and tried to look casually interested rather than intensely focused on every detail of what Gavin was revealing. Offshore LLCs sound complex for domestic architectural projects. That's what I thought, Gavin said, but Dylan insists they provide necessary liability protection for high-end commercial work. He's also been using a separate communication system for architectural consulting business, something about maintaining client confidentiality. Separate communication system, encrypted phone burner devices, separate email accounts. Gavin lowered his voice slightly. Honestly, it seems like overkill for architecture work, but Dylan says his clients require maximum discretion. I felt my pulse quicken as I realized that Dylan's communication security measures suggested he understood that his architectural consulting business involved activities that required concealment, the kind of operational security that people used when they were conducting activities that wouldn't survive scrutiny. Does he ever discuss where his architectural expertise comes from? I asked. I mean, he didn't study architecture and he's never mentioned having formal training in environmental design. Gavin's expression became carefully neutral. the look of someone who had noticed inconsistencies but had chosen not to investigate them too deeply. He says he's always been interested in design and that he's developed his approach through extensive reading and consultation with industry experts. Gavin paused, but between you and me, some of his innovations seem remarkably sophisticated for someone who claims to be self-taught. I nodded as if this was mildly interesting rather than confirmation that Dylan's business success was built on expertise he couldn't possibly possess without access to professional training he had never received. I'm sure he's a quick learner. Definitely, Gavin agreed, though sometimes I wonder if his learning process involves more collaboration than he typically acknowledges. I finished my wine and considered how to extract the most valuable information from Gavin's apparent willingness to discuss his brother's business practices with increasing candor. Collaboration can be tricky in professional services, I said, especially when it comes to intellectual property and attribution. Exactly, Gavin said. And Dylan's been particularly focused on protecting his intellectual property lately, filing patents and trademarks for various design innovations he's developed. There's been substantial legal expenses related to IP protection over the past 2 years. I felt something cold and precise settle in my chest as I realized that Dylan had been spending significant money to legally protect innovations that he had stolen from me, using company resources to build legal barriers around my own work. That sounds expensive. Very expensive, Gavin confirmed, and the timeline has been aggressive. Dylan seems determined to establish legal ownership of his design innovations as quickly as possible, which has required substantial attorney fees and expedited filing processes. I thought about the patent applications Harper had discovered, understanding now that Dylan's rush to claim legal ownership of my work was motivated by more than professional ambition. He was trying to create legal protection against exactly the kind of intellectual property challenge I was planning. Has the IP protection strategy been successful from a legal standpoint? Yes, Gavin said. Dylan now holds patents and trademarks for several innovative design methodologies that should provide competitive advantage for Rhodes Architectural, but the whole process has felt unusually urgent for someone who claims to have developed these innovations over several years. I smiled and signaled for another glass of wine, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that your opponent has been playing defense against threats he created for himself. Urgency can be good in competitive markets. True, Gavin agreed, though sometimes I wonder if Dylan's urgency is motivated by competition or by something else. I looked at Dylan's younger brother, recognizing the intelligence and integrity that had always made him more appealing than his famous sibling. Gavin understood that something was wrong with Dylan's business practices, but he lacked the information necessary to understand exactly what crimes his brother was committing. Gavin, I said, can I ask you something that might seem personal? Of course. Do you think Dylan has been completely honest with you about his business activities? Gavin was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if trying to determine whether my question was casual curiosity or something more significant. Honestly, no, he said finally. I think Dylan has been managing information very carefully over the past few years, and I think some of his business strategies involve activities that he doesn't want me to understand completely. I nodded, feeling the weight of Gavin's admission and recognizing that Dylan's own brother understood that his business success was built on deception. That must be difficult for you professionally. It's been challenging, Gavin admitted, especially because I'm responsible for financial oversight, but I don't always have access to complete information about revenue sources or business development strategies. I finished my second glass of wine and realized that Gavin was providing me with exactly the kind of insider perspective that could transform my legal strategy from property recovery to comprehensive fraud investigation. Have you ever considered that Dylan might be using your financial management systems to conceal activities that would be problematic if they were fully disclosed? Gavin studied my face for a long moment, his expression shifting from casual conversation to something more serious. Are you asking as Dylan's ex-wife or as someone who might have specific reasons for questioning his business practices? I met his eyes directly, seeing the intelligence and moral conflict that had always made Gavin the more admirable Rhodes brother. I'm asking as someone who has recently discovered that Dylan's business success might be built on intellectual property that doesn't belong to him. Gavin's expression shifted to something that looked like relief mixed with apprehension. What kind of intellectual property? I considered how much information I could share without compromising my legal strategy, then decided that Gavin's insider knowledge was worth the risk of partial Disclosure architectural designs that Dylan has been monetizing without proper attribution or compensation. I said innovations that he didn't develop but that he's been claiming as his own work. Gavin was quiet for several seconds, processing what I had told him, and apparently connecting my revelation to inconsistencies he had already noticed that would explain some of the financial irregularities I've been tracking. He said finally, revenue that doesn't quite match Dylan's claimed development timeline, and expenses that seem designed to establish legal ownership rather than develop new innovations. I felt something sharp and satisfying settle in my chest as I realized that Dylan's financial records contained evidence of his crimes and that his own brother was positioned to provide access to that evidence. Would you be willing to help me understand those financial irregularities? Gavin looked around the gallery as if checking to make sure we weren't being overheard, then met my eyes with an expression that suggested he had been waiting for someone to ask him that exact question. Cassandra, if Dylan has been stealing intellectual property and using company resources to conceal that theft, then I have a professional obligation to ensure accurate financial reporting regardless of family loyalty. I smiled, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering unexpected allies in battles you had planned to fight alone. I think we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. I think you're right, Gavin agreed, and I think you should know that I've been keeping certain financial records that Dylan doesn't realize. I've been maintaining detailed documentation that might be very helpful if someone was investigating intellectual property fraud. I looked at Gavin Rhodes, understanding that Dylan's brother was about to become the most valuable asset in my campaign to reclaim everything that had always been Minna Central Park in late October created the kind of atmospheric perfection that made Manhattan feel like a movie set. Autumn leaves scattered across walking paths and families enjoying weekend activities that suggested life was proceeding normally for people whose existences hadn't been systematically dismantled by intellectual property theft. I had come to the park not because I expected to encounter Dylan and Leo, but because I needed to think through my conversation with Gavin in a space that felt removed from the legal and financial complexities that were consuming my day. I recognized Leo before I saw Dylan, his golden coat and distinctive gait, unmistakable even at a distance. Across the great lawn, he was playing fetch with enthusiastic energy that suggested Dylan was at least maintaining his exercise routine, though I noticed that Leo kept looking around as if searching for someone who wasn't there. Dylan appeared a moment later, jogging toward Leo with the kind of athletic confidence that had once seemed attractive but now felt performative. Like everything else about his carefully curated public image, he was wearing expensive athletic wear and wireless headphones that announced his commitment to optimization and efficiency. Even during leisure activities, I stood beside a maple tree whose red leaves created natural camouflage and watched Dylan interact with the dog we had rescued together during the early days of our marriage, when we still believed that building a life together meant sharing responsibility for smaller lives that depended on our care. Leo responded to Dylan's commands, but without the enthusiastic affection he had always shown me, his body language suggesting compliance rather than genuine connection. I should have walked away, preserved the emotional distance I had been cultivating since our divorce was finalized, but something about seeing Leo in Dylan's possession made me realize that this wasn't just about property recovery or intellectual property justice. This was about reclaiming every aspect of my life that Dylan had claimed as his own, including the relationships that had provided meaning during the years when I was professionally invisible. Approached them slowly, giving Leo time to recognize my scent and presence before Dylan noticed my approach. Leo's response was immediate and overwhelming, his entire body expressing joy and recognition as he bounded toward me with the kind of pure emotional honesty that only dogs possess. Cass, Dylan said, his voice carrying surprise and something that might have been guilt. I didn't expect to see you here. I knelt down to Leo's level, accepting his enthusiastic greeting and noting that he seemed thinner than I remembered. His coat slightly less lustrous than when he lived with me full-time. He looks like he's been missing his usual routine, I said, standing to face Dylan directly. He's adjusting fine, Dylan replied, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Dogs are resilient. I studied Dylan's face, noting the defensive way he had positioned himself between me and Leo, as if protecting his claim to possession rather than protecting Leo from potential distress. Is he eating normally? Of course he's eating normally, Dylan said. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of a dog, Cass. I heard the irritation in his voice, the familiar edge that appeared whenever Dylan felt his competence was being questioned, but I also heard something else a note of uncertainty that suggested Leo's adjustment to his new living situation hadn't been as seamless as Dylan wanted to believe. I'm sure you are, I said, though I notice he keeps looking around as if he's expecting someone else to appear. Dylan's expression hardened into the kind of controlled anger that had become familiar during the final months of our marriage. He's fine, Cassandra, and frankly, I don't think it's appropriate for you to approach us during our personal time together. I looked at the man I had once loved, understanding that he genuinely believed he was the victim in this situation, that my presence in a public park constituted harassment rather than concern for an animal we had both claimed to love. You're right, I said. It's not appropriate for me to interfere with your personal time. Dylan's posture relaxed slightly as if he had won a minor victory in our ongoing conflict. I'm glad you understand. I do understand, I said. I understand that you took Leo because you wanted to make sure I had nothing left that could provide comfort or stability. I understand that. This was never about Leo's well-being. It was about demonstrating your power to take things that matter to me. Dylan's expression shifted to something that looked like genuine confusion, as if he couldn't comprehend why I would interpret his actions as strategic rather than loving. That's not true, he said. I love Leo, and I wanted to make sure he had a stable home environment. I smiled. The kind of expression that could mean anything, and knelt down to Leo again, scratching behind his ears in the way that had always made him lean into my touch with contentment. The stable home environment where he lives alone for 12 hours a day while you're at the office, I said. The stable environment where he doesn't have access to the park where we used to run together every morning. The stable environment where he sleeps in a crate because your new girlfriend is allergic to pet dander. Dylan's face flushed slightly, confirming details about his current living situation that I had guessed but hadn't known for certain. How do you know about? I don't need to know about your personal life, Dylan, I interrupted, but I do know Leo, and I can see that he's not thriving in whatever arrangement you've created. I stood and looked directly at Dylan with the kind of calm confidence that I had been developing since our divorce was finalized. But this conversation isn't really about Leo, is it? What do you mean? I mean that taking my dog was just another way for you to demonstrate that you could take anything you wanted from me, regardless of whether you actually wanted it or whether it served any purpose beyond proving your power. Dylan's expression became carefully neutral, the look of someone trying to control a conversation that was moving in unexpected directions. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, I said. I think you've been taking things from me for years and calling it collaboration or partnership or love, but really it was just systematic appropriation of anything that might threaten your image as the sole architect of your own success. I paused, watching Dylan's face for signs that he understood where this conversation was heading. But here's what you should understand, Dylan, I continued. Taking Leo was the mistake that made me realize everything else you had taken, and now I'm going to take back all of it. Dylan's composure cracked slightly, revealing something that looked like genuine alarm. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Rhodes Architectural Consulting, I said. I'm talking about patents filed under your name for innovations you didn't develop. I'm talking about property assets that were enhanced using my professional expertise without attribution or compensation. I'm talking about 8 years of intellectual property theft disguised as marriage. Dylan's face went pale as he realized that our encounter in Central Park wasn't coincidental emotional distress but strategic confrontation. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can, I said. I have documentation that establishes my authorship of every design innovation you've monetized. I have legal representation that understands intellectual property law better than you apparently do, and I have financial evidence that proves you've been systematically stealing from me while building legal barriers to prevent me from reclaiming my own work. I knelt down to Leo one final time, letting him lick my face and whispering that I would see him soon. Dylan, I said, standing and looking directly at him, you should probably review your prenuptial agreement, especially the intellectual property clauses that you never bothered to read carefully. I turned and walked away, feeling Dylan's stare following me across the great lawn and knowing that Leo was watching me leave with the kind of patient loyalty that suggested he understood this separation was temporary. Didn't look back, but I heard Dylan call Leo's name with the sharp tone of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had just shifted dramatically in directions he hadn't anticipated. By the time I reached the park exit, my phone was buzzing with messages from Ellie asking for an update on my weekend activities. I replied that I had just delivered Dylan's final warning and that we should accelerate our timeline for filing intellectual property claims. He walked toward my apartment. Thinking about the difference between emotional attachment and strategic leverage, Leo represented both, but today's encounter had clarified that my campaign to reclaim everything Dylan had stolen wasn't motivated by love or loss. It was motivated by justice and the determination to ensure that no one ever again made the mistake of assuming that Cassandra Morgan could be erased from her own story. Dylan had taken Leo to demonstrate his power, but he had actually provided me with the clarity necessary to understand that this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about restoring balance and ensuring that theft had consequences regardless of how sophisticated the thief believed himself to be. Reached my apartment building and looked back towards Central Park, knowing that somewhere in those autumn-scattered pathways Dylan was probably trying to figure out how much I actually knew about his business practices and how much damage I could cause to the empire he had built using my professional expertise. He was about to discover that I knew everything and that the damage would be comprehensive, permanent, and entirely legal. Thomas Baird's office occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, the kind of space that announced serious work conducted without unnecessary decoration or distraction. His desk was arranged with the obsessive precision of someone whose livelihood depended on finding patterns in complex financial data, and his expression suggested that he had discovered patterns in Dylan's records that were both fascinating and deeply incriminating. I've been conducting forensic analysis on Rhodes Holdings LLC for the past 2 weeks, he said, gesturing for me to sit across from his desk, which was covered with printout spreadsheets and what appeared to be financial flow charts. And I need you to understand that what I've found goes beyond intellectual property theft. This is systematic financial fraud designed to conceal the true source of Dylan's business revenue. I studied the documents he had arranged, recognizing bank statements, tax filings, and patent applications, but unable to immediately comprehend the connections Thomas had identified between seemingly unrelated financial transactions. Show me what you found. Thomas opened his laptop and projected a timeline onto the wall screen that detailed Dylan's business activities from 2018 through the present. The visualization was comprehensive and damning, revealing patterns of deception that extended far beyond the architectural consulting business I had been investigating. Dylan has been operating a sophisticated shell game, Thomas explained, using offshore LLCs to launder intellectual property theft into legitimate business revenue. The architectural consulting business is just one component of a larger fraud scheme that includes patent manipulation, licensing agreements with fictional entities, and tax avoidance strategies that depend on concealing the true ownership of intellectual property. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest as I realized that Dylan's crimes were more extensive and more carefully planned than I had imagined. How does it work? Dylan identifies intellectual property that he can appropriate without immediate legal consequences, Thomas said. He implements that intellectual property in commercial projects, then creates a complex web of corporate entities that make it appear as if he developed the innovations independently and owns them legally. Thomas highlighted specific transactions on the timeline, showing how Dylan had systematically monetized my architectural designs while creating false documentation that established his legal ownership of those designs. The Kennebunkport property renovation was funded through an LLC that was supposedly paying Dylan for architectural consulting services, he continued, but the consulting services were actually just Dylan paying himself to implement designs that you had created. The yacht interior modifications followed the same pattern. Dylan created fictional consulting agreements to justify revenue that was actually generated by your unpaid professional work. I studied the financial flow charts, seeing how Dylan had transformed my intellectual property into multiple revenue streams while maintaining legal distance from the original theft. What about the patents? The patents are the most sophisticated aspect of the fraud, Thomas said, opening a new file that contained patent applications and trademark registrations. Dylan has been filing intellectual property claims for innovations that you developed, then licensing those patents to his own companies at artificially inflated rates. The licensing fees create legitimate business expenses that reduce his tax liability, while the patent income is routed through offshore entities that aren't subject to us taxation. I felt my pulse quicken as I realized that Dylan hadn't just stolen my work, he had created an entire financial empire designed to profit from that theft while avoiding legal consequences. How much money are we talking about? Based on my analysis, Dylan has generated approximately $2 million in revenue using intellectual property that belongs to you, Thomas said. And he's used complex corporate structures to avoid paying taxes on most of that revenue while simultaneously building legal barriers that would prevent you from claiming ownership of your own innovations. I thought about the conference room where Dylan had confidently dismissed my contributions to his success, understanding now that his confidence was based on a sophisticated understanding of how intellectual property theft could be disguised as legitimate business development. Can you prove all of this? I can prove the financial connections, Thomas said, but proving that the underlying intellectual property belongs to you requires the architectural documentation that you and Ellie have been assembling. The combination of your design records and my financial analysis creates a comprehensive case that Dylan has been systematically defrauding you for years. Thomas turned to a new section of his presentation showing communications records that he had apparently obtained through methods I didn't want to examine too closely. There's also evidence that Dylan understood he was committing crimes, he said, encrypted communications with offshore legal advisors discussing strategies for protecting intellectual property that he refers to as acquired through non-traditional channels. I felt something sharp and satisfying settle in my chest as I realized that Dylan's own communications would prove his criminal intent. Non-traditional channels, legal euphemism for stolen. Thomas said Dylan has been working with attorneys who specialize in helping clients monetize intellectual property that they don't legally own. The communications make it clear that everyone involved understood they were facilitating theft. I thought about my conversation with Gavin in the gallery, understanding now why Dylan had been so secretive about his business communications and why he had been using encrypted devices for architectural consulting work. Is Gavin involved in the fraud? Gavin appears to be an unwitting accomplice, Thomas said. His financial records show that he's been managing legitimate business operations while Dylan conducted the fraudulent activities through separate corporate entities that Gavin didn't have complete access to. Thomas opened a final file containing what appeared to be SEC filings and tax documents, but here's where the situation becomes more serious. He said Dylan's fraud scheme involves tax evasion on a scale that would interest federal prosecutors. The offshore entities he's been using to launder stolen intellectual property have failed to report income that should have been subject to US taxation. We're talking about potential criminal charges that extend far beyond civil intellectual property disputes. I studied the documentation that Thomas had assembled, feeling the weight of evidence that could destroy Dylan's business empire and potentially result in criminal prosecution that would make our divorce settlement look like a minor disagreement. What kind of criminal charges? Federal tax evasion, conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering through offshore entities, Thomas said. And if we can establish that Dylan deliberately filed false patent applications claiming ownership of intellectual property he knew belonged to someone else, that's perjury in federal filings, which carry substantial penalties. I thought about Dylan's satisfied expression when he had claimed Leo, understanding now that his confidence in victory was based on his belief that I would never discover the full scope of his criminal enterprise. How do we proceed? Very carefully and very quickly, Thomas said. Once Dylan realizes that his financial records are being scrutinized, he'll start taking protective measures, moving assets to jurisdictions that don't cooperate with us, law enforcement, and destroying documentation that could be used as evidence. Thomas closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who had just outlined a complex but achievable strategy. The beautiful aspect of this situation, he said, is that Dylan's attempts to create legal protection for his stolen intellectual property have actually created a comprehensive record of his crimes. Every patent application, every offshore transaction, every encrypted communication with legal advisors represents evidence that can be used to prove systematic fraud. I felt something cold and precise settle in my chest as I realized that Dylan's sophistication had become his vulnerability. His careful planning had created the documentation necessary to prove his guilt. What's our timeline? Ellie wants to file all intellectual property claims simultaneously next week, Thomas said. I recommend that we coordinate with federal authorities to ensure that Dylan can't take protective measures once he realizes the scope of the investigation. The IRS and SEC would be very interested in his offshore tax avoidance strategies, and the FBI might want to investigate the international money laundering aspects. I thought about Leo, who was probably wondering why his routine had been disrupted, and about the vacation home where I had designed every detail to create spaces that would provide peace and renewal. I want Dylan to understand that this isn't personal revenge, I said. This is professional accountability for systematic theft, Miss Morgan. Thomas said, based on the evidence I've assembled, Dylan's prosecution for federal crimes is essentially inevitable. The only question is whether you want to be credited as the victim who exposed his fraud or whether you want federal authorities To discover his crimes independently, I smiled, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that justice and revenge could be achieved through the same strategic actions. I want full credit, I said, and I want Dylan to understand that this investigation began the moment he took my dog. Thomas nodded with something that looked like professional admiration. I'll coordinate with Ellie to ensure that your intellectual property claims are filed simultaneously with federal notifications. About Dylan's tax evasion and money laundering, he said, the timeline will be aggressive, but the evidence is comprehensive. Dylan won't have time to take protective measures. I gathered my materials and prepared to leave Thomas's office, feeling the weight of evidence that would transform Dylan's confident victory into systematic destruction. There's one more thing, Thomas said, something personal that you should know before we proceed. I paused at the door, sensing that Thomas was about to share information that would change my understanding of Dylan's motivations. Dylan's fraud scheme wasn't just about money, he said. It was about erasing you from your own professional legacy. He's been systematically claiming credit for your innovations while building legal barriers that would prevent you from ever reclaiming recognition for your work. I felt something sharp and final settle in my chest, understanding that Dylan's theft wasn't opportunistic or emotional. It was calculated erasure designed to ensure that I would never be able to prove my contributions to his success. But now his systematic erasure has become systematic evidence, I said. Exactly, Thomas replied. Dylan worked so hard to steal your legacy that he documented every step of the theft, and now that documentation is going to destroy him. I left Thomas's office and walked through Brooklyn, thinking about the difference between theft and recovery, between victimization and justice. Dylan had spent years building an empire using my intellectual property while erasing my contributions to his success, but he had also created the evidence necessary to prove his crimes and restore my professional legacy. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the timeline that would transform Dylan's criminal enterprise into federal prosecution case. Within the next 2 weeks, Ellie would file intellectual property claims that established my ownership of innovations Dylan had stolen. Thomas would provide financial evidence to federal authorities investigating tax evasion and money laundering, and Nadine would execute asset recovery that would transfer ownership of properties Dylan had enhanced using my professional expertise. Dylan thought he had won our divorce by taking Leo and claiming assets that incorporated my work, but he had actually provided me with the motivation necessary to expose crimes that would result in criminal prosecution, asset forfeiture, and professional destruction that extended far beyond anything I could have achieved through conventional divorce proceedings. He opened my laptop and began drafting a letter to Dylan that would be delivered after all legal filings were complete, a letter that would explain exactly how his systematic theft had become systematic evidence and how his confidence in victory had become his guarantee of defeat. The letter began with a simple observation that Dylan would probably recognize as characteristic of my architectural training: attention to detail, structural integrity, and the understanding that every action has consequences that extend far beyond immediate appearance. Dylan, you took the dog in the divorce, so I took your vacation home and your boat, but more importantly, I took back everything that was always mine. And now federal authorities are very interested in understanding how you built your business empire using intellectual property that belongs to someone else. I smiled and continued writing, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that patient planning, thorough documentation, and strategic precision could transform personal betrayal into professional justice. The woman Dylan had tried to erase was about to become the architect of his complete destruction, and unlike his theft of my work, my recovery would be entirely legal, entirely documented, and entirely devastating to every aspect of the life he had built using my professional expertise. Leo would come home soon, and when he did, he would find that the woman who had rescued him years ago had finally learned how to rescue herself. The penthouse overlooking the Hudson River had been transformed into the kind of sophisticated celebration space that announced Dylan's arrival as a major player in Manhattan's tech elite. Crystal champagne flutes caught light from strategically positioned fixtures, while servers in black uniforms circulated among investors, journalists, and industry leaders who had gathered to witness the launch of Rhodes Holdings' newest venture, a luxury yacht charter service that promised to revolutionize high-end corporate entertainment. Many watched the festivities from my apartment 20 blocks away through live-stream coverage that Harper had arranged using her connections in architectural media. The irony was perfect. Dylan was celebrating the monetization of my yacht interior designs while having no idea that federal authorities were reviewing evidence of the systematic fraud that had made his celebration possible. The timing is exquisite, Ellie said from her position beside my laptop where she was monitoring multiple legal filings that would be made public within the next hour. Dylan's moment of maximum visibility will become his moment of maximum exposure. I studied Dylan's image on my laptop screen, noting his confident posture and satisfied expression as he moved through crowds of people who believed they were witnessing legitimate business success rather than the culmination of an 8-year intellectual property theft scheme. His yacht charter presentation included detailed descriptions of innovative interior design that created optimal spaces for corporate networking and client entertainment without any mention of the architect whose expertise had made those innovations possible. Phase 1 filings are complete, Thomas announced from his position at my dining table where he had established a temporary command center for coordinating with federal authorities. The SEC has received comprehensive documentation of Dylan's offshore tax avoidance strategies, and the IRS is reviewing evidence of unreported income from intellectual property licensing. My phone buzzed with a message from Nadine confirming that property title transfers had been processed according to the accelerated timeline we had established. The Kennebunkport vacation home and the yacht Morning Glory were now legally owned by Cassandra Morgan Architectural Holdings LLC, a company I had incorporated specifically to reclaim assets that had been enhanced using my professional expertise. Dylan should be receiving notice about the property transfers right about now, Nadine had written. His celebration is about to become significantly less celebratory. On my laptop screen, Dylan was delivering remarks to the assembled guests about his vision for luxury yacht charters that would provide unprecedented levels of sophistication and innovation. His presentation included detailed descriptions of design elements that maximize social interaction while maintaining privacy, optimal sight lines that connected passengers to ocean environments, and storage solutions that supported extended entertaining without compromising spatial elegancy. I recognized every innovation he was describing because I had developed every concept he was claiming as his own work: the curved bar that encouraged conversation while maintaining service efficiency, the modular seating that could be reconfigured for different group dynamics, the integrated technology systems that provided entertainment options without disrupting the aesthetic harmony of maritime environments. Intellectual property filings are now public record, Ellie announced. Dylan's patents and trademarks are being challenged based on prior creation and documentation that establishes your authorship of every innovation he's claimed to have developed. I watched Dylan continue his presentation, apparently unaware that his business empire was being systematically dismantled by legal filings that would soon become public knowledge. His confidence was remarkable given that he was literally describing stolen intellectual property to an audience that included journalists who would soon be reporting on his systematic fraud. Media notifications have been sent, Harper said from her position near the window where she was coordinating with architectural publications that had agreed to cover the intellectual property theft angle of Dylan's downfall. The story will break simultaneously across multiple platforms. Within the next 30 minutes, I felt something sharp and satisfying settle in my chest as I realized that Dylan's celebration was about to become his public humiliation in front of exactly the audience he had been trying to impress on screen. Dylan was answering questions about his design philosophy and explaining how his innovations represented a revolutionary approach to yacht interior architecture. His responses demonstrated remarkable confidence for someone whose entire business model was built on systematic theft of intellectual property from his ex-wife. There's something beautiful about watching him describe your work in such detail, Ellie observed. He's basically confessing to intellectual property theft on live stream while believing he's demonstrating his creative genius. My laptop chimed with notifications as news articles began appearing online. Architectural publications were releasing stories about systematic intellectual property theft in luxury design industries, using Dylan's business practices as a case study in how sophisticated fraud could be disguised as legitimate innovation. The headlines were devastating: tech entrepreneur accused of systematic architectural theft and luxury yacht charter launch overshadowed by fraud allegations, and former wife exposes years of intellectual property appropriation. The stories included detailed analysis of my architectural documentation compared to Dylan's patent applications, showing clear evidence that he had been claiming ownership of innovations that belonged to someone else. Dylan's phone is buzzing, Thomas observed, watching the live stream as Dylan began receiving what appeared to be urgent calls and text messages during his presentation. I suspect his investors are reading the same news articles we're seeing. On screen, Dylan's confidence was beginning to crack slightly as he noticed people in the audience checking their phones and engaging in urgent whispered conversations. His presentation rhythm faltered as he realized that something was disrupting the celebratory atmosphere he had carefully orchestrated. Property transfer notifications should be arriving momentarily, Nadine's voice said through the speakerphone. Dylan is about to discover that he no longer owns the assets he's been using to demonstrate his business success. I watched Dylan excuse himself from the presentation stage, apparently responding to an urgent message that required immediate attention. His expression shifted from confident celebration to confused concern as he moved toward a private area where he could take what appeared to be an increasingly frantic phone call. The SEC investigation has been confirmed by federal authorities, Thomas announced. Dylan's offshore financial arrangements are now subject to criminal investigation for tax evasion and money laundering charges that could result in substantial prison time. I felt the satisfaction that comes from watching systematic justice unfold with precision. Timing. Dylan's moment of triumph was becoming his moment of total destruction, and unlike his theft of my work, my revenge was entirely legal, entirely documented, and entirely public. My laptop chimed with a new message from Gavin, who had apparently decided that family loyalty was less important than professional integrity. Cassandra, I've provided federal authorities with complete financial records documenting Dylan's fraudulent business practices. I thought you should know that I'm cooperating fully with the investigation. I smiled, feeling grateful for Gavin's moral courage and understanding that Dylan's own brother had become a key witness in the criminal case that would destroy his business empire. Screen. The yacht launch celebration was descending into chaos as guests realized they were attending the public exposure of systematic fraud rather than the celebration of legitimate business success. Investors were leaving early, journalists were conducting impromptu interviews about intellectual property theft, and Dylan was nowhere to be seen, having apparently retreated to handle the crisis that was destroying his carefully constructed reputation. Final phase notifications are being delivered now, Ellie announced. Dylan is receiving legal notice that his patents and trademarks are being challenged, his property assets have been transferred, and federal authorities are investigating his business practices for criminal violations. I closed my laptop and walked to the window overlooking Manhattan, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that patience, preparation, and precision could transform personal betrayal into public accountability. Dylan had taken Leo to demonstrate his power, but he had actually provided me with the motivation necessary to expose crimes that would result in criminal prosecution and professional destruction. It's finished, I said, understanding that Dylan's systematic theft had become systematic evidence and that his confidence in victory had become his guarantee of defeat. Actually, Ellie said with a smile, it's just beginning. Dylan's criminal trial will take months and his civil liability will require years to resolve completely, but his reputation is destroyed immediately and permanently. I thought about Leo, who would soon be returned to me, not because Dylan had developed a conscience, but because his current living situation was about to become significantly more complicated when federal authorities began seizing assets that had been purchased using fraudulent revenue. The real victory isn't Dylan's destruction, I said, it's the restoration of my professional legacy and the warning this sends to other men who think they can steal intellectual property from women without consequences. My phone buzzed with a message from Harper, who was monitoring architectural industry responses to the breaking news. The story is spreading beyond business media. The architectural community is treating this as a watershed moment for addressing systematic intellectual property theft. I smiled, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that personal justice could become professional change. Dylan's downfall would become a case study in how sophisticated fraud could be exposed and how women could reclaim credit for innovations that had been systematically appropriated by men who believed theft was just good business strategy. That evening, I received a letter from Dylan's attorney requesting a private meeting to discuss settlement options that might resolve our dispute without additional legal proceedings. The letter was carefully worded to avoid admitting guilt while suggesting that Dylan was willing to negotiate compensation for any intellectual property that might have been inappropriately used. He showed the letter to Ellie, who laughed with genuine amusement at Dylan's attempt to treat systematic fraud as a minor business disagreement that could be resolved through private negotiation. He still doesn't understand that this isn't about money anymore, she said. This is about criminal prosecution for federal crimes that don't disappear through civil settlements. I drafted a brief response declining Dylan's settlement offer and noting that federal authorities would be determining appropriate consequences for his criminal behavior rather than private attorneys negotiating business disputes. The letter was professional and final, making it clear that Dylan's opportunity for private resolution had ended when he decided to claim ownership of Leo as his final victory. Tomorrow we reclaim the vacation home, I told Ellie, and next week Leo comes home permanently. I fell asleep that night thinking about the difference between revenge and justice. Dylan had systematically stolen my professional identity while erasing my contributions to his success, but his theft had also created the evidence necessary to restore my legacy and expose crimes that would protect other women from similar exploitation. The woman Dylan had tried to erase was about to become the architect of a new standard for intellectual property protection in creative industries, and unlike his theft of my work, my victory would create permanent change that extended far beyond our personal conflict. The same conference room where our divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier felt different under the harsh fluorescent lighting of an emergency legal meeting. Dylan sat across from me with the pallor of someone who had spent sleepless nights discovering that confidence was insufficient protection against systematic legal consequences. His expensive suit couldn't disguise the tension in his shoulders or the dark circles under his eyes that suggested his world was collapsing faster than he could process. His legal team had expanded to include criminal defense attorneys and crisis management consultants, the kind of expensive professionals who specialized in helping wealthy people navigate federal investigations without complete destruction of their reputations and finances. Their presence filled the conference room with the anxious energy of people who understood that their client had committed crimes that couldn't be resolved through private negotiation. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, Dylan's lead attorney said with the careful courtesy that lawyers used when they needed cooperation from people who held nuclear weapons. My client is hoping we can find a mutually beneficial resolution to the current legal complications. I studied Dylan's face, noting the way he avoided direct eye contact and the nervous habit of checking his phone that suggested he was monitoring news coverage of his downfall in real time. His confident superiority had been replaced by something that looked like genuine fear as he realized that systematic fraud had systematic consequences. I'm listening, I said, though Ellie and I had already agreed that no settlement offer would be acceptable since Dylan's crimes required criminal prosecution rather than civil resolution. Mr. Rhodes is prepared to acknowledge that certain intellectual property disputes may have merit, the attorney continued, and he's willing to discuss compensation arrangements that would provide appropriate recognition for any contributions that may have been undervalued during your marriage. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest as I realized that Dylan was still trying to minimize his crimes by describing systematic theft as intellectual property disputes and 8 years of fraud as undervalued contributions. What kind of compensation arrangements? Ellie asked with the tone of someone who was professionally obligated to hear settlement offers even when those offers were completely inadequate. Dylan's attorney opened a folder containing what appeared to be financial projections and asset transfer proposals. Mr. Rhodes is prepared to transfer full ownership of the Kennebunkport property and provide monetary compensation equivalent to 50% of the revenue generated by Rhodes Architectural Consulting over the past 3 years, he said, in exchange for withdrawal of all intellectual property claims and agreement to a comprehensive non-disclosure arrangement. I looked at Dylan, who was finally meeting my eyes with something that looked like desperate hope, as if he believed that money could resolve criminal behavior and non-disclosure agreements could erase federal investigations. How much money are we discussing? I asked, not because I was interested in accepting his offer, but because I wanted Dylan to understand the scope of his theft. Approximately $1 million in direct compensation plus property transfer valued at $3.7 million, the attorney replied, which represents substantial acknowledgement of your creative contributions to Mr. Rhodes' business success. I smiled, the kind of expression that could mean anything, while thinking about the difference between acknowledgement and justice. Dylan was offering to pay me for work that had always belonged to me while asking me to help him avoid prosecution for crimes that had federal authorities very interested in his business practices. That's an interesting proposal, I said, but I have a few questions about the terms. Dylan's expression brightened slightly, as if he believed I was considering his settlement offer rather than planning to demonstrate why his crimes couldn't be resolved through private negotiation. First, I continued, How would your non-disclosure arrangement affect the federal investigation into your tax evasion and money laundering activities? Dylan's face went pale as he realized that I understood his settlement offer couldn't protect him from criminal prosecution that was already underway. Second, how would transferring ownership of properties that you enhanced using my stolen intellectual property constitute compensation rather than simple restoration of assets that were always mine? I paused, watching Dylan's confident hope transform into something that looked like genuine panic. And third, how would your acknowledgement of my creative contributions explain the patents and trademarks you filed, claiming to be the sole inventor of innovations that you stole from me? Dylan's attorney cleared his throat with the uncomfortable sound of someone who had just realized that his client's settlement strategy was based on fundamental misunderstanding of criminal law. Miss Morgan, we understand that emotions are running high, he said, but we believe that private resolution serves everyone's interests better than prolonged legal proceedings. Actually, Ellie interjected, my client's interests are served by ensuring that intellectual property theft has appropriate consequences regardless of whether those consequences are convenient for your client. I stood and gathered my materials, feeling the satisfaction that comes from watching someone realize that their attempts to control a situation had actually guaranteed their complete defeat. Dylan, I said, looking directly at him, your settlement offer demonstrates that you still don't understand what you've done or what's about to happen to you. Dylan's expression shifted to something that looked like genuine confusion, as if he couldn't comprehend why I would reject his offer to pay me for work that he had stolen. You didn't just undervalue my contributions to your business success, I continued. You systematically stole my intellectual property, built your entire professional reputation on my innovations, and used offshore financial arrangements to avoid paying taxes on revenue generated by my work. I moved toward the door, understanding that this conversation was finished and that Dylan's opportunity for private resolution had ended when federal authorities began investigating his criminal behavior. The FBI and IRS aren't interested in settlement negotiations, I said. They're interested in prosecuting federal crimes, and your offer to pay me for my own work doesn't change the fact that you committed those crimes systematically and deliberately. Dylan finally spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his voice carrying the strained tone of someone who had just realized that confidence was insufficient protection against evidence. Cass, please, he said, we can work this out privately. We don't need to destroy everything we built together. I paused at the door, feeling something sharp and final settle in my chest as I understood that Dylan genuinely believed we had built something together, rather than recognizing that he had systematically stolen everything I had built. Dylan, we didn't build anything together, I said. You stole everything I built and convinced yourself that theft was collaboration. But now federal authorities are reviewing 8 years of evidence that documents your systematic fraud. I opened the door and looked back at the man who had once seemed like the most important person in my world, understanding now that he had never been important. He had just been effective at making me believe that my work was less valuable than his approval. Your criminal trial will begin within 6 months, I said, and unlike our divorce proceedings, federal prosecutors aren't interested in what's convenient for you. They're interested in what's legal, and what you did was systematically illegal for years. I left the conference room, feeling the satisfaction that comes from refusing to accept inadequate compensation for systematic crimes. Dylan's settlement offer had confirmed that he understood the scope of his theft, but it had also demonstrated that he believed money could resolve criminal behavior that required criminal prosecution. In the elevator, Ellie smiled with something that looked like professional satisfaction mixed with personal pride. That was perfect, she said. Dylan finally understands that this isn't a business negotiation, it's a criminal investigation, and his only remaining options are cooperation with federal authorities or criminal trial with comprehensive evidence of his guilt. I thought about Leo, who would be returned to me permanently within the next week. Not because Dylan had developed a conscience, but because his living situation was about to become dramatically more complicated when federal authorities began seizing assets that had been purchased using fraudulent revenue. The real victory isn't Dylan's prosecution, I said. It's the precedent this case will establish for addressing intellectual property theft in creative industries. We reached the lobby and stepped into the afternoon sunlight that felt warmer and brighter. Then I remembered autumn light creating patterns of shadow and illumination across Manhattan sidewalks where people were conducting the ordinary business of their uncomplicated lives. Dylan thought he could steal my legacy and erase my contributions to his success, I said. But instead, he documented every theft so thoroughly that his crimes became irrefutable evidence of systematic fraud. I walked toward my apartment, thinking about the difference between settlement and justice. Dylan's offer to pay me for my own work represented his final attempt to control a situation that had moved beyond his ability to manage, but justice required consequences that extended beyond financial compensation. That evening, I received a call from Gavin, who had been cooperating with federal authorities investigating his brother's criminal activities. "Cassandra," he said, "I wanted you to know that Dylan's business empire is being systematically dismantled. Federal authorities are seizing assets that were purchased using fraudulent revenue, and several of his major investors are withdrawing funding based on the criminal investigation." I felt the satisfaction that comes from discovering that systematic crimes had systematic consequences, extending far beyond individual prosecution. "How is Dylan handling the investigation?" "Not well," Gavin replied. "He seems to believe that if he can negotiate with you privately, he can make the federal charges disappear, but his attorneys have explained that criminal prosecution doesn't work that way." I smiled, understanding that Dylan's confidence in his ability to manipulate situations had become his greatest vulnerability when faced with federal authorities who weren't interested in his charm or his money. "There's something else," Gavin continued, "something I thought you should know before the media reports it." I waited, sensing that Gavin was about to share information that would change my understanding of Dylan's current situation. "Dylan's new girlfriend left him yesterday," he said. "Apparently she didn't appreciate discovering that her boyfriend was under federal investigation for systematic fraud and that his luxury lifestyle was built on stolen intellectual property." I thought about the expensive perfume I had noticed in the Kennebunkport master bedroom, understanding that Dylan's carefully constructed image was collapsing as quickly as his business empire. "And Leo?" I asked. "Dylan asked me to take him," Gavin said. "He claimed it was temporary until his legal situation stabilized, but I think he realizes that federal authorities might seize Leo as an asset that was acquired using fraudulent revenue." I felt something warm and final settle in my chest, understanding that Leo would be returned to me not through legal proceedings but through Dylan's recognition that he could no longer provide care for anyone other than himself. "I'll pick him up tomorrow," I said. "And Gavin, thank you for choosing integrity over family loyalty." "Actually," he replied, "I think helping expose Dylan's crimes was the most loyal thing I could do for my brother, even if he doesn't understand that now." I hung up the phone and looked around my apartment, which would soon be filled again with the sound of Leo's tail thumping against furniture. When I came home from work, Dylan had taken my dog to demonstrate his power, but he had actually provided me with the motivation necessary to expose crimes that would restore my professional legacy and protect other women from similar exploitation. Tomorrow Leo would come home permanently, and when he did, he would find that the woman who had rescued him years ago had finally learned how to rescue herself. 6 months later, I sat on the deck of my Kennebunkport home watching Leo chase seagulls across the beach with the enthusiastic energy of a dog who had finally returned to his proper place in the world. The morning sun created patterns of light across the ocean that I had calculated precisely when I designed the window placement years ago, though I was only now able to appreciate those patterns from the perspective of legal ownership rather than stolen innovation. The house felt different under my sole proprietorship, not because the architecture had changed but because every design element now carried recognition rather than erasure. The curved glass walls that captured sunrise, the custom millwork that integrated modern convenience with historical character, the sight lines that connected interior spaces to ocean views, all of it was finally credited to its actual creator. "Coffee's ready," Harper called from the kitchen where she was reviewing architectural plans for our newest project, a women's retreat center that would provide workspace and support for creative professionals who had experienced intellectual property theft. The project represented everything I had learned about creating spaces that honored both innovation and authorship. Joined Harper at the kitchen island, where she had spread blueprints for buildings that would integrate my architectural expertise with her fresh perspective on sustainable design. Our partnership was the kind of creative collaboration I had once believed I shared with Dylan, except this collaboration involved actual sharing of credit and compensation. "The foundation board approved our final designs," Harper said with the excitement of someone whose first major architectural project would be built according to her specifications, rather than stolen and credited to someone else. "Construction begins next month and completion is scheduled for next spring." I studied the plans, feeling satisfaction that extended beyond professional Achievement: the retreat center would provide legal and financial support for women whose intellectual property had been systematically appropriated by men who believed theft was acceptable. Business strategy: our architecture would create spaces for healing and empowerment, while our programming would provide practical tools for reclaiming stolen work. Any word from the prosecutor's office? Harper Askidi opened my laptop to check messages, finding an update from the federal attorney handling Dylan's criminal case. His trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier with convictions on all charges, including tax evasion, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and perjury in federal patent applications. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month. Dylan's attorney filed an appeal, I said, but the prosecutor doesn't expect it to succeed. The evidence was comprehensive and Dylan's own communications proved criminal intent. I scrolled through additional messages, finding updates from other women who had contacted me after Dylan's case became public knowledge: architects, designers, and creative professionals who had experienced similar intellectual property theft and who were using the legal precedent from my case to pursue their own justice. The architectural community has been transformed by your case, Harper observed. Intellectual property theft is no longer considered a minor business disagreement. It's recognized as systematic fraud that requires criminal prosecution. I thought about the conference room where Dylan had confidently claimed Leo as his final victory, understanding now that his theft of my dog had been the catalyst that exposed his theft of my entire professional legacy. My phone buzzed with a call from Ellie, who was reviewing civil litigation against Dylan's business empire separate from his criminal prosecution. The civil cases would continue for years as other victims of his intellectual property theft pursued compensation for their stolen work. Settlement offers are still arriving, Ellie said. Dylan's remaining assets are being liquidated to pay civil judgments, but the criminal convictions mean he'll be in federal prison for the next 8 years. I watched Leo return from his beach exploration, sand coating his golden fur as he settled beside my chair with the contentment of a dog who understood he was exactly where he belonged. 8 years seems appropriate, I said, though I suspect Dylan will spend most of that time trying to understand how his confidence in manipulation became his guarantee of prosecution. The real victory is the systemic change, Ellie replied. Your case established legal precedent that will protect creative professionals for decades. Intellectual property theft is now prosecuted as seriously as any other form of fraud. I finished my coffee and walked onto the deck, where Leo was already claiming his favorite spot in the morning sun, thinking about the difference between revenge and restoration. Dylan's prosecution had provided satisfaction, but the real victory was the restoration of my professional identity and the creation of legal protections that would prevent other women from experiencing similar theft. Miss Morgan, a voice called from the beach path leading to my property. I recognized Thomas Baird approaching with a folder that probably contained final documentation from Dylan's criminal case. His forensic analysis had provided the financial evidence that transformed intellectual property disputes into federal crimes. Final asset recovery documentation, he said, climbing the steps to my deck. Dylan's remaining properties have been liquidated and the proceeds distributed to victims of his fraud scheme. Your compensation totals $7 million, plus recovery of all intellectual property rights. I accepted the folder, feeling satisfaction that was more about validation than money. Dylan's systematic theft had been systematically documented and systematically prosecuted, ensuring that his victims received both financial compensation and legal recognition. There's something else, Thomas continued, something that demonstrates the comprehensive nature of Dylan's downfall. He opened a second folder containing what appeared to be employment records and professional licensing documentation. Dylan's criminal convictions have resulted in permanent disbarment from business licensing in 17 states. He said he'll never again be able to operate companies or file patent applications, and his criminal record will be permanently associated with intellectual property theft. I felt something sharp and final settle in my chest, understanding that Dylan's professional destruction was as comprehensive as his systematic theft had been sophisticated. The man who tried to erase my professional legacy has had his own legacy permanently associated with fraud. I said, there's symmetry in the outcome. Thomas nodded with something that looked like professional satisfaction mixed with personal justice. Criminal prosecution ensures that Dylan's name will be permanently connected to intellectual property theft, he said, while your name will be permanently connected to exposing systematic fraud and creating Legal protections for creative professionals. After Thomas left, I returned to the kitchen where Harper was photographing our architectural plans for submission to design publications that would credit both our names equally and prominently. The kind of professional recognition I had been systematically denied during my marriage to Dylan. The retreat center will be featured in Architectural Review next month, Harper announced, with a complete profile of your career and recognition of your innovations that were previously uncredited. I smiled, feeling the satisfaction that comes from discovering that stolen work could be restored and that professional legacy could be reclaimed even after years of systematic erasure. The article will also profile other women whose intellectual property has been appropriated by men in positions of power, Harper continued. Your case has become a catalyst for addressing systematic theft in creative industries. I looked around the kitchen that I had designed years ago, when I still believed that creating something beautiful with the person you loved was worth sacrificing credit for your contributions. The space was unchanged, but my relationship to it was completely transformed from stolen innovation to restored authorship. That evening, I received a letter that had been forwarded through my attorney's office. The return address indicated it was from Dylan at the Federal Correctional Facility, where he was serving his sentence. The letter was brief and carefully worded to avoid admitting additional guilt while expressing something that might have been remorse. Cassandra, I've had time to think about our marriage and the mistakes I made. I understand now that I took credit for work that belonged to you, and I want you to know that I recognize your contributions to my success. I hope you can find peace and happiness in your new life. He read the letter twice, trying to determine whether Dylan's acknowledgement represented genuine understanding or strategic positioning for potential appeal proceedings. His language was careful to avoid confirming criminal behavior while suggesting personal growth that might generate sympathy. I showed the letter to Leo, who sniffed it briefly, then returned to his position by the fireplace, apparently unimpressed by Dylan's attempt at posthumous apology. What do you think? I asked Leo. Should I respond? Leo opened one eye briefly, then closed it again, apparently indicating that Dylan's letter didn't warrant serious consideration from either of us. I folded the letter and placed it in a file labeled correspondence that I maintained for historical documentation, then returned to reviewing applications from women who wanted to attend our retreat center programs for creative professionals who had experienced intellectual property theft. Applications told stories that were remarkably similar to my own. Brilliant women whose innovations had been systematically appropriated by men who believed that theft was acceptable business strategy, architects whose designs had been implemented without credit, engineers whose patents had been filed under other names, writers whose ideas had been developed into successful projects that excluded their authorship. Reading their stories, I understood that Dylan's theft of my work wasn't exceptional. It was representative of systematic exploitation that extended across creative industries, and that my victory could become their template for reclaiming stolen intellectual property. I drafted responses to the applications, feeling the satisfaction that comes from transforming personal justice into professional change. Dylan had stolen my work, but his theft had also created the legal framework that would protect other women from similar exploitation. As autumn darkness settled over the Maine coast, I walked onto my deck where Leo was conducting his evening security patrol of our property. The ocean sounds and salt air created the kind of peaceful environment I had envisioned when I designed this space years ago, though I was only now able to appreciate it from the perspective of someone who had reclaimed rather than lost her professional legacy. I thought about the woman I had been 8 years ago when I married Dylan, someone who believed that love meant sacrifice and that supporting someone else's dreams was worth abandoning your own dreams. That woman had been systematically erased by intellectual property theft disguised as marriage, but that erasure had also created documentation that enabled restoration. And the woman standing on this deck was stronger, clearer, and more purposeful than the woman Dylan had tried to eliminate. My phone chimed with a final message of the day, this one from Gavin, who had rebuilt his career as a forensic accountant specializing in intellectual property fraud investigations. Thought you'd want to know that 3 more cases similar to yours have been filed this month, he wrote. Using the legal precedent your victory established, intellectual property theft is finally being prosecuted as seriously as other forms of fraud. I smiled, understanding that Dylan's systematic theft had become systematic change and that his crimes had created legal protections that would benefit creative professionals for decades. Leo completed his patrol and settled beside my chair with the contentment of a dog who understood that his pack was finally complete. I scratched behind his ears, thinking about the difference between taking and reclaiming, between theft and recover. Rydelin had taken Leo in our divorce, but I had taken back everything that was always mine: my intellectual property, my professional legacy, my architectural innovations, and my capacity for creating spaces that honored both function and bowtie. Man who had tried to erase me from my own story had instead provided me with the evidence necessary to write a better ending, one where justice was both personal and systematic, where theft had consequences, and where women could reclaim credit for innovations that belonged to them. I stood on my deck overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, thinking about tomorrow's plans, reviewing architectural submissions from young women who wanted to create without fear of appropriation, meeting with attorneys who were using my case as a template for prosecuting intellectual property theft, and designing spaces that would provide both shelter and empowerment for creative professionals who had experienced systematic exploitation. Dylan thought he had won our divorce by taking my dog, but he had actually given me the motivation necessary to expose crimes that would protect other women from similar theft. The woman he had tried to erase had become the architect of his complete destruction, and the guardian of legal protections that would honor creative work for generations. Leo and I went inside to our restored home, where every design element carried my name and my recognition, where the work that had been stolen was finally credited to its actual creator, and where tomorrow would bring new opportunities to transform personal victory into professional change that extended far beyond our individual story. Real victory wasn't Dylan's destruction. It was the creation of a world where intellectual property theft was prosecuted as systematically as it was committed, and where women could create without fear that their innovations would be stolen by men who believed that appropriation was acceptable business strategy. Fell asleep in my own home with my own dog, beside my own architectural achievements, finally credited to their actual creator, understanding that sometimes the best revenge wasn't destruction, but restoration, and that justice served with precision was more satisfying than any emotional retaliation could ever be. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.